Welcome to the Arizona Author Series. This event was recorded on February 20th, 2025. The Arizona Author Series is supported by the Arizona State Library Archives and Public Records, a division of the Secretary of State, with federal funds from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We are pleased to hear from Dr. Alan J. M. Noonan, author of the book Mining Irish American Lives, Western Communities from 1849 to 1920. Alan J. M. Noonan earned his Ph.D. in history from University College Cork in 2013 and has received several prestigious history fellowships, including the Glucksman Government of Ireland Fellowship at New York University and the Kluge Fellowship at the Library of Congress. He also served as the inaugural historian in residence for Cork City Libraries during the decade of centenaries. He has written extensively on migration, American social and cultural history, the Irish diaspora, and has produced podcasts on the history and formation of An Garda Síochána, the Irish police force, and the Docklands of Cork. Currently, he teaches at the University of Montana. We are pleased to hear from Dr. Noonan and glad you can join us.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I want to thank the Arizona Authors Talk Series and the State of Arizona Research Library, and in particular, the librarian Yam Levin, who you just heard from there, who approached me to participate in this series and has nothing but been extremely helpful in organizing this for me so that I can talk to you here today. I'll mention that programs such as these, where authors can speak about their research and their work, are valuable venues, both in giving us authors an opportunity to showcase our writing to the public and also to support authors who might be outside of traditional institutions, traditional or not. All humanities is under serious strain at the moment from the recent ramping up of decades of neglect, and any effort to support history should be publicly applauded. And I would say that with the notice that I would ask you to please purchase the book if you can, pass on word of it to others, and please leave any public reviews if you like it. And if you don't like the book, please disregard all of that, but do purchase it. Anyways, the book origins. So this book started in the research process for my doctoral dissertation from archives, great and small personal collections of immigrant letters, hospital logbooks, detective reports, census figures, newspapers. The eminent historian Jolie once described me as the most traveled historian of my generation, although being a Kerryman, there might be some loaded insult in that term, the most endearing of insults, of course. And one book review very kindly described the research as absolutely astonishing. There were planes, trains, automobiles, walking, cycling, driving, hitchhiking, around Ireland and the United States, and in particular, of course, the American West, on a shoestring budget, searching for these records and documents. And in particular, it was the voices of these people who lived in these Irish communities in the American West that really attracted me to what was going on, these Irish American communities. And so I'll just share the slide I have here. And so while we see this image, and this is an image of miners in the Bunker Hill and Sullivan mine, many of whom were Irish immigrants. This is kind of the typical view that people have when you think of miners in the American West. Of course, it was a much longer and more varied process than this. And of course, I open my book with a description not of a male miner, but of Nellie Cashman, a person born in Cork, like myself, and who was also involved in mining and prospecting. And I kind of did that just so to jilt the reader out of the general expectations that they have about a book about mining communities necessarily focusing entirely on the occupation. The occupation certainly had an influence on these people, both in terms of the wages that they were collecting, in terms of the dangers of the place that they were working in, and in terms of the formation of groups that were involved in it. But the people themselves, their own personal lives and stories are much more varied and different than that. And that extends to the Irish who were involved in all of these different communities out in the American West, whether it was small mining camps or large towns like Butte and Virginia City, Leadville, or whether it was involved in the earlier gold rush or the later hard rock mining that sort of would be that classical image. Just to describe that image a little bit more as well, the transition between the earlier, more physical labor of using a pick and drill to mechanized mining there. That tool, that instrument that they have there inside that mine was called a widowmaker. And you'll notice what was nicknamed the widowmaker by the miners, because in that transition to an increasingly industrialized, mechanized mining form, safety standards significantly lacked behind what was happening. And you'll notice that all of those miners, none of them were wearing any face masks to protect them from the dust that was being kicked up while they were working in the mines. And of course, silicosis and physical infirmity would have been a serious problem that the workers themselves would have reported, and was one of the reasons for the emergence of labor unions, which were dominated by the Irish. But anyways, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So the centrality of the Irish to the development of Western mining led me to this line that I use in the beginning of chapter 1, which is, wherever a hole, a pit, or a shaft was dug in America, chances were good that the person hewing this rock was Irish. And the main thesis of the book that's focusing the sort of story that it's telling is that Irish Americans, with that hyphen in the name, remained a distinctive group from white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and continued to demonstrate their ethnicity in the mining West well into the 20th century. Much of the book is about the vital importance of place, and not just the place where you are, but the place where you came from, the place where you were traveling through, what were you doing there? And then an even greater emphasis on identity, right? Who were you? Who were your people, perhaps as importantly? And the talk, as we're kind of going to go forward and as you're kind of going to hear, will be focusing on a few main questions that might be worth thinking about. And if you have any other further follow-ups, either from having written the book or read the book, excuse me, or having heard some of what I say today, feel free to ask any questions. But the questions that should be thought of when you sort of read this book might be, you know, who was Irish? Who was Irish American? What does it mean to be Irish American? What does that hyphen in Irish American mean? Sometimes it was a bridge between two different places, you know, expressed in the people themselves as this sort of shifting identity. And sometimes it was a chasm where the distinctions between those two places, Ireland and America, seemed almost irreconcilable. And the final question is, who was American? And that is a question that was brought front and center during the American Civil War, when many Irish died serving in the Union armies and claimed their place in America. But those debates and those battles indeed continued throughout the American West and into the 20th century. And just in case that those points might get people thinking of their relevance to history, it's worth reiterating what I said about the importance of the humanities in history. Again, programs such as these book talks. And of course, there is that common refrain, if you don't know where you came from, how do you know where you're going? And that was a question that kind of, dare I say, haunted a lot of these Irish immigrants out in the American West. So it was a sort of little phrase, a little saying, that Ireland's greatest exports were its people. And one of the big drivers in the Irish emigrating out to the American West, one historian, David Emmons, describes the settlement of the Irish in Butte. Butte became effectively an Irish town. He describes it as they're fulfilling their desire for jobs, comrades, and wives. In my book, I go further than that, and I say that actually it's the movement for opportunity. And opportunity was encompassed both in the earlier things that Emmons describes, which are jobs, right, high wages, comrades and wives, the possibilities of setting up communities, setting up links, but also in a broader sense, setting up their own communities where they would be accepted, and the opportunity to do so, the opportunity to bring in others, those transatlantic links that continue to linger. And here in this painting, which is held in the Crawford Gallery in Cork, is called The Immigrant Letter. And here it's a young schoolgirl who has learned to read, or possibly learned to read English, reading an immigrant letter for the family. And these immigrant letters were not just going back and forth between different places in the American West and back over to Ireland, although they were primarily doing that. They were also between networks and nodes of Irish communities throughout the United States and throughout the world as well. Wherever the Irish were settled, they had these connections and ties, discussions between family, friends, about what exactly the circumstances and the potential and the possibilities were in these different areas. And so when we're talking about that, these possibilities and these sort of ideas and identities really come into focus. As Bartholomew Colgan in Carson City, Nevada, writes back home, he is saying that there is nothing that gives me greater pleasure than to get letters from my friends, even if they are short ones. And another one bemoaned Picmac. He bemoaned the fact that in one of his letters that back home they must have forgotten that there was such a person as Picmac. And so these letters were vital both in sustaining the individual immigrants and also in sustaining those networks which tied the individual immigrant and immigrant communities, the Irish and the American West, together. When it comes to the gold rush in the middle of the 19th century, we should remember that a large bulk of the Irish immigrants are fleeing An Gcuirt na Mór, the Great Famine, which is this cataclysmic disaster that occurs in Ireland, mass starvation and death, causing emigration really to become endemic and persistent in Ireland, and encourages huge numbers of Irish to leave to go over to the United States primarily, but also the UK, Canada, other places around the world. A portion of these, the ones who have some amount of resources, join the gold rush and head out into the American West and California with what it is that's going on. And I'll take a quick side note to mention, inside in the Irish census, the 1901 Irish census, a person called Farrell Riley. His occupation is listed, this is in the Irish census, minor California, USA, returned American. And that the returned American is in parentheses. And so I want you to think about that for a second, right? So this Farrell Riley had been transformed by the experience of mining over in America. He was now transformed by his occupation, right? Because this is what he's listing, minor California, not just minor. It's an explanation of his journey. And he's not noted as a returned Irish. He's noted as a returned American. So to the Irish, he has been utterly transformed by his experience of being abroad. In the earlier part of it, before he says returned American, minor California, USA, there are occupations in the US that are listed as minor, those who are also mining and those who would have been either silver mining or gold mining or involved in some sort of gold rush or mining rush activity, prospecting or whatever. But in this particular instance, and there are a few others as well in that Irish census, there's an element of pride there too, right? That this is one of the few people who struck it rich, that they really were the fortunate or the skilled or the lucky, depends on the way that you want to interpret it. The returned American, though, is fascinating. And indeed, down in West Cork, where huge numbers migrated from the copper mines of the Allihies over to Butte, Montana, one person who returned, and very few returned. The Irish have one of the lowest repatriation rates of any immigrant community in the United States in the 19th and early 20th century. One returned immigrant was forever known as John the Yank Harrington. This became his name, his identity. So you were transformed by this migration process. Letters would inform people about what it is that's going on. Patrick Catherwood wrote of an Irish relative thinking of emigrating. that the money does tempt him. He thinks that he would have the full sack before that he would be there long with you. And so it's not just sort of the high money, it's also the possibility of quick money, the speed of getting that wealth. But there was also other reports, contrary reports, and this is quotation from another letter sent back home to Ireland. They fully confirm previous reports from the mines and all agree in saying that it is the greatest humbug ever got up in any age or country. So you have mixed reports based on the experience of the miners. This is a notice that was published in the National Police Gazette, sort of an early version of a tabloid, but it is an indication of these sorts of warnings that were going out about these dangers in the American West as well. And newspapers were obviously an important source of information about what was going on. And this, supplemented by the letters back home, would have provided immigrants, possible immigrants, with an awful lot of their information of what is going on. You can see here at the top that he opens up with a find, and then after making a good bit of money, he goes to a spree in Frisco, whether it's San Francisco or Frisco in Colorado, I'm not sure that it's writing about. But the third part there, he's after spending his money, so now he's waiting for a grub stake. And a grub stake is where a merchant or wealthy person in a town would basically front you the resources that you need to go prospecting again. And finally, that last little part of the cartoon is called the bedrock. Obviously a play on words there with the miner having committed suicide, and the caption reads, "How life passes with the mine prospector of the Great West, a career which has many mutations and generally ends in tragedy." And of course, the bottle in the illustration also links the alcohol consumption to the prospector's ruin, which is kind of tied into the emerging progressivism movement and various sort of early prohibitionist sort of ideas. But for the Irish, it wasn't just simply this cartoon which would have been impactful enough. For the Irish immigrants, and in particular the Catholic Irish immigrants, which formed the overwhelming bulk of the Irish immigrant population, you would have had an additional danger, which was that of the spiritual. And the spiritual danger was very much a real one, right? The isolation from the institutions of the Catholic Church. And Father O'Hanlon, he wrote a guidebook for Irish immigrants in the middle of the 19th century, just following the California gold rush. And he writes that in all cases in which Catholics mediate removal to a remote and partially settled country, we would advise the formation of companies and colonies, not so much for the purposes of mutual protection and assistance in encountering the dangers of wilderness and colonization, as to obtain for themselves the spiritual succor they require, and which, under other circumstances, cannot often be procured. And this is reinforced as well in the personal accounts of Father Andrew Toomey, a priest who was drawn to a large Irish Catholic community in Smartsville, California. And he served that community, which was scattered in the foothills, but also, you know, there was a group in the town of Smartsville. But he noted of a man called Patrick Galligan, and this is in the interment record of Smartsville, California. He died on the 10th of October, 1888, almost 60, of heart disease, and it's noted in that interment record, quote, "He was found dead alone in his cabin, seemed to have been dead a couple of days, and consequently did not receive the last rites of the church. It was a clear example of how one should always be prepared, and how dangerous for a person to live alone and remote from assistance." So, obviously, the Catholic Church is putting its stake out there and warning people to be careful of that. And yet, despite these warnings and despite these dangers, vast numbers of the Irish went to the American West. And a big part of my work is sort of re-emphasizing the underestimation of the Irish numbers in those figures by historians in the past, previously using just the born in Ireland figures. I use those who have, I include in my figures for the Irish community of the American West, those whose parents are both Irish born. And again, it would be my sort of assertion that the Irish American community in the American West is larger than had been previously sort of acknowledged. If there were still warnings coming through in the letters, there are still also an awful lot of remittances that are going back. And some of the remittances, money going back from America over to the United States, some of it is being used back in Ireland, and other amounts of it are being, a large amount of it, large percentage of it, that Schreier, Arnold Schreier, who was arguing that, who has some figures on that, he says that a large portion of that is used to continue the chain migration that goes forward. Michael McGee wrote a letter from Leadville, Colorado, to his parents in County Donegal, and families understood as well that Ireland was undergoing difficulty and troubles. There was a later famine in the latter part of the 19th century, not nearly as severe as An Gortamór, the Great Famine. But the letter writing home says that the report is here that people are dying in Ireland with the hunger, and that there was a large sum of money collected here for the relief of Ireland. So you will find this letter, in this letter, the sum of £20, lest you be in need of anything. As long as I have it, whenever you want money, let me know about it, and you shall have it while I have it. I think some of them lads will do better in this country than they will do here. And how important this money was as well for the payment of rent. One farmer in Cork reflected on his neighbours. Only for them in America, it would have been thrown out by the landlord. And so that's a fairly direct and strong statement on the importance of remittances as well. The expectation amongst immigrants, both from the families back home and also within themselves and within their community, to support those back in Ireland or in other parts of America, to continue those lines of communication and those financial links, were also embedded in the expectations of the immigrant themselves. And so you have, in an Irish language, poem written by an immigrant. Bheas chun capel a ceannach dom bhuinter is un. I was going to buy my mother a horse and a lamb as well. Right? So the feeling that they failed or could fail their families and friends was something that often weighed them down. The immigrant expectation obviously was weighed heavy upon them. But to support and sustain them out in these areas, the Irish very quickly created communities. And these communities, while the Catholic Church was warning against isolation, the Catholic Church played a very integral part in the sustaining and the supporting of these Irish communities, either through churches, the building of hospitals, and the building of schools as well, of course, for children of the community. And so the Irish in the American West proved extremely capable at applying and appealing to the seminarians, the seminaries over in Ireland, for Irish priests and Irish nuns to go over and offer that minimal level of care, a very good level of care by the standard of the time, but at a very affordable rate. And minors would often get a lower rate of subscription insurance, in effect, for from these hospitals that were set up as Catholic institutions. The institutions themselves were open to others, and in the logbook of Virginia City, for example, run by the Daughters of Charity, they have about 10, maybe close to 20% of the logbook would be other groups, other populations. The vast majority, probably close to half, is Irish American who are patients within the hospital. And we have a whole series of different causes and injuries. The overwhelming number of them, of course, is debility, infirmity from miners who are working in the mine, again, from those physical ailments or injuries, a huge number of physical injuries from the mines, but also women who are suffering the effects of the proximity of this industrial mining and the dangers of the mines. One woman is killed when dynamite explodes underneath her boarding room house that she was managing, and another one is shot through the leg when there's a fracas inside in the town, and she survives. But there are all sorts of dangers in these communities as well. The fraternal Oh, yes. The fraternal element is also something that should be emphasized as well. And so that while you have these institutions that exist, in the 19th century, there are a large number of fraternal organizations that might seem a little alien to us in the 21st century. This one in particular, this photo is from the Ancient Order of Hibernians in front of St. Patrick's in Butte, Montana. The name of the church should give some indication of the Irish presence there. But the Ancient Order of Hibernians in the American West was for, there was also a ladies auxiliary. You'd see a large number of ladies present in that meeting too, is an organization that effectively where Irish born and their descendants can join together. They often offer insurance, they often offer community activities. They were a way of supporting and sustaining that Catholic network throughout the American West, but also inside in those communities themselves. The massive numbers of fraternal organizations, not just Irish American organizations such as this Ancient Order of Hibernians, but the massive number of fraternal organizations that the Irish were participating in should be an indication as to some of the exceptional nature of the Irish immigrants in the United States and then also in the American West as well. And it's one of the reasons for their real power and prominence in the political system, within the towns themselves, how the Irish were able to understand organizational structures, interact with them, participate in them. How did the Irish develop this innate sense of organization and participation? Well, they learned it from back in Ireland, mostly through membership in organizations of resistance. Daniel O'Connell's organization to try and get Catholic emancipation would have taught them the importance of non-violent mass meetings, of being able to come together and protest. And later in the 20th century then, you also have groups like the Land League, which are very able to bring together tenants to protest for better treatment and rights within a very exploitative system, colonial landed system back in Ireland, which was obviously dominated by the Protestant aristocracy, the Protestant ascendancy as it's called. And of course, I'll tell a little bit of a story here where in the American West, as well as the AOH, you also have other revolutionary organizations, Clan na Gael, groups who are dedicated to the violent overthrow of British rule in Ireland. And one of the people who's over in America in the late 19th century is a man called Michael Davitt. He's a leader of the Land League. And he speaks in Virginia City, which is one of the largest cities in the American West at this time. And it's a branch of the Land League in a packed opera house. And he tells the audience that we can afford to put away the harp until we have abolished poverty, mud cabins, and social degradation. And so he is actually arguing against the fiscal force nationalists of Clan na Gael, who would also be within this group, within this organization. And he's arguing for the economic betterment of the people of Ireland over that other overthrow of Britain sort of argument. So you have the two disparate ideas about Irish nationalism sitting side by side, existing in Virginia City, Nevada, which is, 5,000 miles away from Ireland. And these debates are lively. There's a packed opera house. The people who were there would have understood these debates and these arguments and what exactly he's saying. Davitt talked about his visit to the American West in his book, The Fall of Feudalism. And he mentioned of a man, Mr. J.W. Mackey, the Silver King, he was nicknamed. He was an Irishman who basically hit it rich. He made a heap of money in the Comstock Lode. And this is the Davitt speaking now in his book. He attended our Land League meeting, but could not be prevailed upon to make a speech. He did not believe either in the agrarian or any other Irish movement. It was all a waste of individual and national energy and means. Why not leave the whole island to England, bring your people all over here, settle them down in Nebraska or Colorado, and call the state New Ireland or Home Rule or whatever you like, and end the whole trouble? And Davitt replies pretty quickly. He says, and give American millionaires the chance of buying up all the land of New Ireland in advance, I suppose. Anyway, Mackey laughs at the retort, but he believed that eventually all Irish people would eventually find their way over across the Atlantic, and such was the scale of emigration from Ireland that people thought that. But you can see another a third view right there that exists of what exactly is a course of action for the Irish, whether it was a waste of individual and national energy, as Mackey kind of suggested. Davitt, kind of looking at things from an economic viewpoint, you can see that he is attacking more broadly the entire capitalist structure, right? The unfairness embedded in it. Now, this is a period in time where Henry George's Progress of Poverty would have been very popular as well. There was a broad understanding of the economic imbalance and exploitation that was occurring in this particular time. But getting back to the story, afterwards, Davitt was approached and he was asked by the local land league how much money he had collected from Mackey, because obviously he was talking to him for a good while. And he replied that not a cent, not a cent. And then they followed up with, did you ask him? He said, no. And then they replied, but what is the blank blank use? And the blank blank is in the actual text. So you can imagine the sort of language that they were using against poor Michael Davitt in this use of the league, sending over a man to beg money who does not ask for it. And then this is Davitt saying, and I confess, I left a very small reputation for obtaining funds behind me in the city of the Bonanza mines. These cities out in the American West were sustaining these organizations back over in Ireland as well as individual families through remittances. And indeed, those links and those funding opportunities would lead to eventually the 1916 Easter Rising, and then furthermore the War of Independence as well. And Eamon de Valera visited Butte, Montana as well, which had superseded Virginia City. Virginia City had effectively been played out at that stage. Leadville then for a time was the most Irish place in the American West, and then Butte overtakes it as well as the black beating heart of Montana. And of course, black was a double phrase. It didn't just mean the industrial pollution of the city. It also meant that Irish Catholic element within Butte that was so heavily in Butte was also in some ways, seditious, un-American West at least, un-Montanan. And so, it was definitely distinctive. On the question of the actual identity of these people who were living in the American West, Michael Mooney, an Irish Labour leader in Leadville, Colorado, he's arguing with someone who was employed by the mine companies to basically have a sort of public debate. And in that public debate, the Mooney argues about the Irish labour organization, the Irish individual mine workers' allegiance to the United States. And he says this, he says, I don't know that the whole American flag covers me, but I think I have a corner. It is cast in our teeth that this is an Irish movement. And he's talking about the labour union there. They say the Irish element is getting too strong. When our country's flag was assailed, the Irish element was not too strong. And Michael Mooney is rebuking that comment from the spokesman of the mine companies up in Colorado, talking about the fact that, all of this sort of protest, all of this sort of this resistance to the large mine companies is in some way un-American. To go further with that point, how broad was that sort of idea held? Was it just simply the mine companies that were holding it? Was there a broader societal sort of interpretation to it? Now, remember, I was just talking about the various organizations of resistance, like the Land League or Clan na Gael, that existed throughout the American West in these mining communities and these mining camps. So what was the feeling of the sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants? Woodrow Wilson, the waspiest of the wasps, viewed the Irish immigrant influence on labour relations. And if you look at any of the labor unions in the American West during this period. You look at their leadership, you look at their membership roles, the Irish form a huge part of that. Woodrow Wilson, in his book, A History of the American People, he writes that the workers, the mine workers, were adopting Irish strategies, such as the boycott, in order to, and this is his quote from the book, to enact, quote, their radical programs of social and political reform. Now, what are these radical programs, right? So the tool that they're using is the boycott. And as I was talking earlier on about the exploitative land structure in Ireland, the economic system in Ireland, the boycott was developed by the Land League against Captain Boycott, who was using rack rents against his tenants over in Ireland. That's where the phrase comes from. And so the tenants effectively, they go on strike, they boycott him, and his harvest fails because he doesn't have the workers to be able to bring in the harvest from his lands. And so this tactic proved very successful. And you see these sorts of tactics of labor organization, these awareness of the importance of labor organization, the importance of participation, the importance of forming alliances with other groups, either through the inclusion of varied ethnic groups. And in Arizona, you have an Irish alliance with the Cornish. In Idaho, you have an alliance with the Irish and the Italian immigrants who were brought in effectively as strikebreakers into the Coeur d'Alene mining district. And you also have varied other alliances throughout the American West with different groups. This is a negotiating process, and it's also one in which there were groups that could be excluded. And the exclusion, of course, in the case of Arizona, often meant the Hispanic workers, but other groups as well, in order to solidify their control and their influence within the region, and also to work against those who were perhaps too cozy with the mine companies, those who were either offering discriminatory mining hiring practices, like perhaps Cornish mine managers preferring not to hire Irish Catholics, and then also in other cases you have sort of more extreme anti-Irish policies, such as in Idaho, for example, where in one of the strikes there's a letter that is sent from a mine manager over in near Helena to the mine manager in the Coeur d'Alene, and this is the Bunker Hill and Sullivan, one of the Bunker Hill and Sullivan strikes, where he says that the company have effectively decided to do a lockout to throw out the striking or any miners who were associated with the labor unions. And the letter says to it, from this mine manager over Montana, I sincerely hope that you will be able to teach the Irish a lesson they will not soon forget. And of course, in their more general conversations, they're talking, oh, it's the trade union, it's definitely the trade union, but the mask comes off, and the importance of understanding these ethnic dimensions, the Irish-American connection, the importance of the identity and linking these people and groups together, in tying them together, which forms some sort of resistance, some sort of opposition, and some sort of demand for increasing wages or better safety in the mines or whatever it was. And so the companies, many of the mine companies, are intent on shattering that unity. And they often do it. They're well aware of the importance of identity, culture, and community in this part of sort of resistance and forming this resistance to the mine companies. Many of the early hiring company cards, these are the early systems of collecting information about who it is that's working in the various mines. They become basically a way of mine companies forming blacklists, right, that they would exclude miners that they know have some sort of affiliation either with trade unions or some sort of affiliation. And of course, one of the questions that they're asking name, address, various others, medical condition, and they ask ethnicity, they ask identity. And so the mine companies realized the importance of this connection in the 19th century. They're linking it in to their system of information, what it is that they think would be the important sort of parts that are are allowing workers to kind of come together. The shifting sort of understanding, this, by the way, we'll just quickly look at this photo. This is another fraternal organization. This fraternal organization is the Emmett Guard, which are a group that, and there were many of them in the 19th century, which were sort of pseudo-militias whose goal it was to ostensibly fight for Irish independence back in Ireland when a large rebellion took place. But you can see the huge numbers of the Emmett Guard there involved in this parade out in, it's in Virginia City, Nevada. And I think, I'm not sure if this is actually taken in Virginia City. This actually could be Gold Hill that the photo was taken. But either way, it's sort of a symbol both of the power of the Irish community and also the power of the Irish community to really resist any efforts directed against them, right? Okay, sure, they're an organization that is supposed to be armed for the purposes of heading back over to Ireland, fighting for independence, but they're armed in Virginia City. And so anti-Irish prejudice discrimination would be greatly frowned upon. It was in effect a sort of a statement. And an awful lot of these parades, kind of people think of St. Patrick's Day parades as these sort of, you know, little walk around the place. But in the 19th century, they're an affirmation and an assertion of Irishness in the United States. So a sort of important part of that identity. While I talked a little bit about Woodrow Wilson there, I'll mention some other sort of feelings and perceptions and perhaps some of the successes of the Irish in America and in their effort in shifting their perception. And so we have the Immigration Commission, which is known as the Dillingham Commission, 1911, and they talk about these different groups. And mining, again, becomes this important refrain as well, right, in understanding how that group is. It affects how the Irish are seen nationally. So the American West is having this sort of effect on how the Irish are being seen. But the Irish are described, and being Irish, I'm not sure how I feel about this, but they're described as acceptable immigrants because they are, quote, English or Scotch in blood, Teutonic, and in parentheses, Nordic, in type, rather than Celtic. And so this is sort of the increasing desperation, I call it desperation, really, in an effort to exclude others, but in order to draw in the Irish because they've either become too powerful, they've asserted their place, it's too difficult to exclude them from the processes. So what do they talk about the other groups? Well, they talk about German Jews as classed as Slavic, and Serb Croatians are quoted as being of savage manners. And the Poles, they verge, this is quotation, they verge towards the northern races of European, end quote. But they do earn a mention as pseudo-acceptable, quote, because they are, as unacceptable, because, quote, they are high-strung, end quote. And so the commission is bending itself backwards to try and form different understandings of these racialized identities that exist in the earlier part of the 19th century, right? What was it to be white American in the earlier part of the 19th century? Well, it was white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. That was it. You know, they were excluding anyone who was not that group. And the expectation was that you become that. Here come the Irish, and they say, no, we're not interested in being that. We'll be Irish American. You know, we will have our own identity, but we won't be that. And so that element of resistance to, you know, religious conversion, both back in Ireland, controlled by Britain, and then over in America. You know, the Irish would not have resisted it for decades and centuries just to come to America to say we're abandoning it wholesale. So no, they go the different direction, and they try and show that that hyphen can exist, that hyphen can actually show an element of loyalty, that you can be both Irish and American. Anyways, the last we'll skip that one. The last slide here that I have, and it's a fascinating one, and I'll kind of go back to a particular quote that I used from a man that I've mentioned already, President Woodrow Wilson. He is touring, trying to drum up support for the Land League in the American West, and he's in Pueblo, Colorado, and the assembled miners, they're both German Americans and they're Irish Americans, and they're harassing him. The German Americans, because Woodrow Wilson is very much on the side of the Entente powers during the First World War and is after drawing the United States into the war against the Germans. And the Irish are hostile to him, both because he is refusing to allow the Irish at table at the Treaty of Versailles, the post-World War I negotiations. So the Irish, World War I was ostensibly fought for the right of small nations to exist. Those are Wilson's words. And he is refusing the Irish delegation entry into these negotiations. And anyways, they are kind of annoying him, harassing him, and he suddenly loses his temper. And he says, "I cannot say too often, any man who carries a hyphen about with him carries a dagger that he is ready to plunge into the vitals of this republic." And so here we have, well into the 20th century, this suspicion, this fear of the hyphenated American. And there's a cartoon there in front of you called The Hyphenated American. And at the very front of the line, you see half Irish and half American, and everybody else coming behind. But the Irish in the front, obviously very important. And underneath it, it's Uncle Sam looking disdainfully. Why should these freaks cast whole ballots when they are only half American? So that question of identity was really still up for debate throughout this process. And in the book, I illustrate that sort of negotiation, how important it was that the Irish were able to create communities and then recreate them in different places as either the mines played out or as the opportunity lessened in different places. And really, again, they interpreted this American West, this Irish American West, on their own terms and in their own form. Thank you very much for your attention.
That was wonderful. And I think we all learned so much. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions. I'm just going to read them out to you. I have been researching an Irish-born Civil War veteran from Salem, Massachusetts, who was a shoemaker/manufacturer. He died in a mine explosion in 1901 in Duncan, Arizona, in a mine in which he appears to have been a part owner. I ran across his records while indexing records for the Massachusetts Catholic Order of Foresters. Have you run across any Catholic Foresters organizations?
I have come across members who were a part of the Foresters and other groups, other fraternal organizations. So while I primarily kind of spoke about the Irish and Catholic organizations, both nationalist and religious, the Irish were also members of different groups, the Elks, the BPOE, the Benevolent Protective Order of Elks. In the Progressive Men of Montana, one of the Irishmen who I believe is also a Civil War veteran, his name escapes my mind right now, but he describes the BPOE as, quote, the best people on earth. And so the Irish were very happy to join membership, to become members with these various fraternal organizations. Usually they were excluded from the Masonic organization, obviously because of the anti-Catholic element. But yeah, those other groups have significant numbers of Irish. And again, that sort of awareness of the importance of either insurance, at early versions of insurance, right, where they were protecting them from disaster, protecting their families from disaster, but also those sort of friendly connections, right, making friends, having links with people in other communities. And of course, what I like about that story, what I like about that question is, look at the links, right? It's all the way from Massachusetts, all the way over to Arizona, and then it's an Irish fella. It's all of these sort of, we think in terms of very narrow geographic areas, but it's actually a much broader world of the 19th century than we kind of think about. That's a great question. Thank you very much for that.
I have a question. You stated towards the beginning of your presentation that Irish immigrants had one of the lowest repatriation rates of any immigrant group. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that is looked upon an awful lot. And if I had another hour or two, we'd talk some more about it. The biggest reason was, I suppose, the economy of Ireland being that sense of being unable to sustain the people. If you want a good sort of movie reference to that, John B. Keane's The Field is an outstanding reference, right? You know, he's the main character, Bull McCabe, is talking about his family. It was like, I was the eldest, so I had to inherit the farm, and for the rest, it was the coffin ships. You know, everybody else had to emigrate. And that sort of emphasis persisted into Ireland well into the 20th century, 1980 sort of job. So it was very much a sort of cultural emphasis. Why so few returned then again? Again, it was this idea, I'll use Kirby Miller's phrase, exiles and immigrants, right? This idea that they had been forced to leave Ireland. There are two groups of diasporic populations in the 19th century, and a diaspora is a forced migration, right? And the two diasporic populations in the mid-19th century are the Jews of Eastern Europe, who are suffering those pogroms, those religious attacks, and then also the Irish, who are leaving because of the Great Famine, right? And so there is that element of shame. And you see in the immigrant letters within my book, this real debate tearing at their hearts, where they are like, we had to leave. You know, we were forced to leave. You know, we had no choice in leaving Ireland. And, you know, that becomes a very sorrowful lament. In fact, it becomes, you know, a theme in popular Irish music. You know, the Danny Boys, those sorts of songs, they become so popular and so well known that it just becomes a constant theme in the Irish psychology. And so it becomes very difficult for Irish people to return back to Ireland. And those who do, the few that do, like I said, they're changed. They're not just changed themselves, but the Ireland has changed. It's often decades later. Those that visit it, one describes it, I am greatly disappointed in seeing my homeland. He left when he was a small boy, very difficult economic circumstances, and he returns and says that the people are a shadow of their former selves, right? But really, it's just that the whole country has changed. He doesn't recognize anybody. Nobody remembers him from when he was young, and it's this heartrending experience that you just cannot return back there. Anyways, I talk about it more in the book, but that is an excellent question. Yeah, very low repatriation rates.
Can you tell us about the Irish mining magnates, Daly, Walsh, etc., and their views or degrees of support for Irish republicanism in
Ireland? That's a dangerous question. I'll tell you why it's a dangerous question. Daly, in particular, I suspect, this is just between us, I suspect Daly was probably a big supporter of Irish nationalist causes. He burned his papers after he died, which meant that we lost an awful lot of records and documents. And really, you know, that probably would have sustained maybe 10 books. But Daly, we know, was a great supporter of the Irish community in Bute. And if Daly is this massive supporter of the Irish community in Bute, really partially responsible for the size of the community, the fact that Bute is being called the Gibraltar of unionism, that is trade unionism, in the American West, the fact that the Irish have this solid and strong position in one of the wealthiest mining cities in the United States, well, then it would make total sense for him to be involved in sustaining these Irish causes back there. The quote that I gave you about Mackey, I think, kind of shows a different approach, right? I think, Fairflood, Mackey and O'Brien, they all kind of had different interactions with their own Irish history. And there's a recent book about I won't go off track, but I think they all have different sort of interactions with their own ancestry and with their supportive community. More directly, I think that Virginia City, as it emerged, and the Irish community in Virginia City does owe quite a significant portion to their preferential hiring practices. I think that the Irish in both Virginia City and in Bute would have existed without their support or sustaining, right? Those areas needed skilled workers, and often the Irish were able to provide a number of these hard rock miners. However, for it to become as large as it did and to become as sustaining as it was, I think is in much larger part than had been sort of mentioned by other previous historians. And it's probably one of the points of not necessarily contention, but perhaps disagreement with Dave Emmons, who doesn't necessarily think that Daly did a whole pile or as much as I think he did for the Irish community. There are other examples, actually. I'll just quickly note. I talk in my book about a man called Thomas Cruise. And Thomas Cruise struck it rich up at the Drumlumman mine, near enough Helena. It's up up by that area and in Montana. And he became fabulously wealthy, primarily by holding on to a 1/6 stake of the gold mine when he sold it out to an English corporation, I believe. Anyways, the hiring practices that you see at some of these other mines that are owned by Irish mine owners, they tend to be more preferential. But Thomas Cruise basically walked away from the management of the Drumlumman mine. And so what you see emerge in the Drumlumman mine and up in the town of Helmsville is actually the emergence of anti-Catholic organizations, which is quite interesting and hasn't been spoken about a lot. I did a little bit of research into it. It's kind of an interesting story. But Thomas Cruise himself was sort of this fascinating figure who really stuck it out in Helena, where there was this significant sort of anti-Catholic sort of feeling and sentiment. And he kind of built that Catholic church in Helena, primarily to stick it to the very waspy atmosphere up in that town. And it kind of stands there proudly to this day as a testimony for him. If he didn't necessarily sustain an Irish community up there, he was going to, make notice that, look, we're here anyway, and I'm here. And so you better put up with it. Anyway.
Excellent. So 2 more questions. I think we have time for 2 more. One is, which states out west have the most Irish immigrants? And in general, do you have a sense of numbers, percentage? I'm sure it changed over time because people move around a lot, but do you have a sense?
There are. I specifically didn't want to make this about statistics and figures. I have very hard worked figures and statistics in the book, which, here we go, which people are welcome to look at. In 1880, the largest percentage of Irish born are in California, then Colorado, then Nevada, then Montana, then Idaho. Now you have to remember as well that the reason for those figures in 1880 is because California has the most developed, the largest mines, things like that, and the other mines are kind of emerging, right? So again, as I said, in 1870, Virginia City is the most Irish city in the United States. In 1890, it's Leadville, Colorado, and in 1900, it's Butte, Montana. Now that's interesting, right, in and of itself, that of those 3 decades, the most Irish percentage-wise cities in the United States are all mining cities in the American West. Right, so this is a sort of indication of the huge Irish presence out in the American West. And I try to, as much as possible, emphasize that it is not simply these urban centers. It is the broader states, these other smaller mining camps and towns that exist as a sort of network themselves that also form a large portion of these sort of disparate communities as well. So I know it's a quick answer, but it's something that changes over the decades. So yeah. Good question.
Good answer. Okay, and last question is, how often did anti-Catholic sentiment, especially from the KKK, affect Irish immigrants? Did this help them gain any solidarity with other Catholic immigrant groups, such as Italians or Polish people, or other ethnic white groups like Jewish people, Germans, or maybe racial groups? And I know that's probably you could write a book just about that, but
you could, and it's an outstanding question because one of the things that I try to show in my book is actually that these alliances didn't emerge broad line, right? That in different places, you have different alliances emerging, different groups sort of coalescing. In certain places, they find solidarity in their religion, and in other cases, they're very hostile to each other. In California, I remember reading of a guy called Father Florian, who's I believe, an Austrian priest, and he's talking about the fact that the Irish are taking up all the pews in the church, and they won't let the German Catholics sit in the church at all, and then they end up having separate graveyards, right? So there's a Catholic Irish cemetery and a Catholic German cemetery. And indeed, you can talk as well even further about the fact that there is that splinter of the Polish Catholic Church in the United States, primarily because the Irish Catholics, Irish American Catholics dominated the Catholic Church in the United States so much that they were like, look, we're not even getting a say in here. We're just going to go off and do our own thing. So the question of solidarity is a massive one. And I'm kind of working on a second book to do with song stories and poems from mining communities throughout the United States. And so you see overlaps and interplays in different degrees and different levels with the other groups. They're writing songs together. One writer, I believe he writes this a poem, a Scoto, what is it? A Scoto Hiberno Anglo poem, right? And he's trying to tie all of these disparate identities together to sort of build solidarity. So song and poems are one way of doing it. Other ways are through trade unions. And trade unions, again, you have to remember they're emerging entities. This is not the stage where they know what a trade union is, they know how to organize it. They're creating the foundations for what exactly a trade union is and how it interacts in American society. And so within these structures, what is it going to be? Well, the earliest trade unions in the United States in the 19th century are the Knights of Labor, right? They're a fraternal organization. And so they shift and morph from that into a broader grouping where they're trying to draw in different identities. They realize the importance of solidarity, but in certain cases, the trade unions, they go against identity, they go against different groups, and in other cases, they ally together. It's a story, again, a brilliant question. I'd love to talk for longer on it, but it's a brilliant question. And if you were to draw something from my book, it's not necessarily that constant refrain of all historians, right? This book is a start, but what I would like you to draw from it is maybe an indication of the complexity of the relationships between the different ethnic groups in the American West, right? They are all staking their claim, talking about what sort of Americans they want to be, what sort of Americans they see themselves as, what sort of Irish America it's going to be. And so that negotiating process is one that is filled with either friction and sometimes fusion, linking between the different groups. And it shifts over time as well, from initial generations that are dominated by the born-in category, like, for example, the Irish-born, to the next generation, the broader category of Irish-American, to the third generation, where you see the initial category is almost entirely intermarrying within the ethnic group itself, Irish marrying Irish. In the secondary group, you start seeing the children of the Irish-born marrying Catholic groups, now accepted, broadening their terms, and then it becomes more broadly acceptable in the generation after that. So anyways, that's a very brief and sort of disparate answer to a wonderful question. Thank you so much for that.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen here one more time. Okay, so thank you very much for your time, Alan, and to all of our attendees for joining us today. On the screen, you will see a link to a brief survey, which will also be emailed to you if you register for the event, and your feedback is greatly appreciated. The recording of this presentation will be made available on our YouTube channel, so watch your email for a shareable link. Feel free to share it with friends who may have missed today's presentation, and we hope to see you at future events or in our reading room. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you.